I love hiking alone. People always warn against it: bad weather, wild animals, getting lost. But I prepare well. I check my maps, pack my gear, and make sure my phone is charged. I like the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being cut off from everything and everyone. That's why I picked this trail. It was remote, barely mentioned in any guidebooks. A narrow stretch of dirt cutting through dense forest in the northern Appalachians. Not many people came this way, which was exactly what I wanted. I started early in the morning, parked my car at the empty trailhead, and set off. The air was crisp, the trees thick and towering on either side of me. The trail wound through old-growth forest, untouched, wild, perfect. The first few hours were peaceful. Just the sound of my boots on dirt, the occasional rustle of leaves, a bird call in the distance. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the rhythm of walking, the weight of my pack, the smell of damp earth. Then I saw the first sign of her. Footprints, not mine. The dirt was soft from recent rain, and the prints were fresh. Barefoot, the toes dug deep, the heels barely touching the ground. Small, delicate, a woman's maybe. They weren't going in one direction. They crisscrossed the path, looping in circles, veering off into the trees before coming back. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a camper, maybe someone wandering off trail. But something about them unsettled me. I walked faster. By midday, I stopped for lunch near a fallen tree, unzipping my pack and pulling out a protein bar. I sat, stretching my legs, listening to the distant rustling of the forest. Then I saw her, 100 feet down the trail, standing perfectly still. A woman, thin, pale, wearing a long, dirty dress that hung loose over her frame. Her arms hung limply at her sides. Her hair was tangled, black, falling over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing me. I felt a cold rush through my body. I didn't know why. She wasn't doing anything. She wasn't holding a weapon. She wasn't charging at me, but she was watching. I slowly packed up my things, keeping my eyes on her, trying to act like I wasn't spooked. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was out here foraging. There were reasons she could be here, but none of them felt right. I stood, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started walking again. Not fast, not slow, just normal. I didn't want to look scared. As I passed where she had been standing, my chest tightened. She was gone. No sound, no movement, just trees. I walked faster. The trail got steeper, climbing up a ridge. The air felt heavier. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw her again. Then I found the second sign, a piece of fabric. It was tangled on a low-hanging branch, a scrap of the same dirty dress she had been wearing. I didn't touch it. I walked faster. By late afternoon, the forest grew denser. The trees pressed in closer. The shadows stretched longer. I checked my GPS. I had a few miles left before I reached my planned campsite. I told myself she was gone. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick, wet, like meat left in the sun too long. I swallowed hard and kept walking. The smell didn't fade. It got stronger. Then I saw it. Off the trail, through the trees. A deer, or what was left of it. The stomach was split open, ribs glistening white. Flies swarmed over the dark, wet insides. The head was missing. The legs were twisted at unnatural angles, broken. I stepped back. My breathing was too loud in the silence. This wasn't a predator kill. Predators don't do this. I turned back to the trail and nearly screamed. She was there, closer now, standing at the edge of the trees, her head tilted slightly. Still, silent, watching, my hands clenched into fists. I didn't run. I wanted to. My body screamed at me to, but I didn't. I just walked, steady, controlled. I don't know how long I walked before I looked back. She was gone, but I knew she wasn't. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was setting. I forced myself to go through my usual routine, set up my tent, start a fire, eat. I told myself I was fine, but I wasn't. I kept listening, straining for any sound, and then I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, scraping against my tent. Slow, light, fingertips dragging across the fabric. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The scraping stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up and left. I hiked faster than I ever had in my life, nearly running. The trail twisted, the trees blurring past me. My only thought was getting back to my car. Then I saw the footprints again. Ahead of me, fresh. She had been here. I broke into a sprint. The last mile was a blur. The forest thinned, the dirt path turned to gravel, and then my car. Exactly where I left it. I fumbled for my keys, practically throwing myself inside, locked the doors, started the engine, and then, in the rearview mirror, she was standing at the tree line, still, watching. As I drove away, she didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I never went back. But sometimes, when I hike alone, I get the feeling I'm being watched. And sometimes I find footprints. They're too small to be mine. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike in took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness, barefoot, that night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor, barefoot, dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it, that awful crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. I had left the city early, hoping to reach the place by late afternoon, but the last stretch of road was nothing but gravel and potholes. It slowed me down more than I expected. My truck bounced and groaned over the uneven path, tires spitting dust and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other vehicles, not even an old hunting shack. Just miles of thick forest closing in from both sides, the trees growing taller and denser as I climbed higher into the hills. I had rented this cabin for a full week. I needed the break. Work had been draining me dry, and I couldn't stand the noise of the city anymore. I didn't want to hear cars honking or people yelling or the endless ringing of my phone. I wanted silence. I got what I asked for. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Small, isolated, and simple. Just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water, just an old rain barrel outside that was half full from the last storm. A shed stood a few yards away, filled with firewood and rusted tools. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, damp with the scent of pine and earth. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just whined through the branches. Perfect. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been here in months. Dust floated in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small, grimy window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I set my gear down and took a look around. The cot was covered in an old wool blanket. A few dead leaves curled in the corners. The wood stove was cold, a few charred logs sitting untouched inside. A stack of old newspapers sat on the table, yellowed and brittle. I dropped my bag beside the cot and got to work setting up. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled the lantern with oil, and checked my food supply. I had packed everything I needed: canned beans, jerky, rice, a couple of protein bars. Enough to last the week. The first night, I kept things simple, heating up a can of chili on the stove and eating in silence. By the time the sun set, the forest outside had become a black wall. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The cabin had only the lantern and the soft glow of the stove. Everything else beyond the window was pitch black. I stared out for a while, listening. Nothing, not even crickets. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to bed early, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. Something was moving outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened, straining my ears. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't darting around like a raccoon or sniffing like a deer. It was deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wooden walls. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, peering out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited. The footsteps had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, climbed back into bed, and lay awake for hours listening. Morning came slow. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold. I sat up, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. My mind was still foggy from the restless night. Then I saw the footprints, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The dirt around the porch was soft from the recent rain, and the tracks were clear. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the window before trailing off into the trees. My stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. The prints were human, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe some drifter had been passing through. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. But why would someone be wandering barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The forest was still, the air heavy and damp. The tracks led toward the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven 6 hours to get here. I had planned this trip for months. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been half dreaming the footsteps in the night. I decided to stay. I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopped wood, cleaned up the cabin, took a short hike, making sure not to wander too far. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to lock the door. I woke up to the creaking of the porch. Someone was standing outside. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboards groaned under slow, careful steps. Then silence. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, clicked it on. The light reflected off the window, blinding me for a moment. I squinted, heart pounding. Then I saw it, a face, pressed against the glass, filthy, smiling. I recoiled, my pulse slamming in my ears. By the time I grabbed the hatchet from beside my bed and turned back, the face was gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight out. Nothing but empty woods. The trees swayed in the wind, branches creaking. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set, dozens. They surrounded the cabin. Some led to the window. Others stopped at the door. My stomach turned. I had been surrounded all night. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, shoving my gear inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking. The wires had been cut. My chest tightened. My head felt light. I turned, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt them watching. I grabbed my bag, my hatchet, and started walking. The nearest road was miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I walked fast, then faster, then I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a small gas station on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, breathless, hands shaking. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't explain. I didn't know how to. I hitched a ride back to the city. Never went back for my truck. Never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but they had been close. Too close. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. First, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. Nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. But there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to. I've always been comfortable in the woods, maybe too comfortable. I've spent years hiking, camping, and exploring deep forests, the kind where you don't see another person for miles, where the only sounds are the wind through the trees, the distant call of birds, and the crunch of your own boots on the dirt. I always thought I knew the woods, but this trip changed that. I set out early, my pack loaded with everything I needed for a few days alone in the backcountry. The weather was perfect, cool, dry, with a light breeze. My plan was to follow an old, unmarked game trail deep into the mountains, an area few people ever went. That's what I liked about it. By midday, I was miles from the nearest road. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me, their branches blocking out most of the sky. The further I hiked, the quieter it got. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the woods. It was perfect, or at least it should have been. I first noticed it when I stopped to rest. The silence, not the normal, peaceful stillness of the forest. This was different. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds, It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I was deep enough into the woods that maybe the usual animal sounds were just further away. But the feeling stuck with me. Something was off. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The place looked untouched, like no one had camped there in years. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and sat back, listening. Still nothing. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Then, in the distance, a sound, faint, almost too quiet to notice. A sharp, clicking noise. It came from somewhere deep in the trees. At first, I thought it was a branch creaking in the wind, but there was no wind. I sat still, listening. The clicking came again, rhythmic, deliberate. I tried to place it, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. And it was getting closer. As the sun dipped below the trees, I forced myself to ignore the unease in my gut. I ate a quick meal, kept my fire burning bright, and sat with my back to a tree, scanning the darkness beyond the flames. That's when I saw it. Movement. Something shifting in the trees, just beyond the firelight. Not walking, not running, perched. A shadow, high up in the branches, clinging to the side of a tree. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make out the shape. It was big, too big to be a bird. Its body was long, thin, with wings folded against its sides. Its head wrong, stretched. It was watching me. I didn't move. For a long moment, neither of us did. Then, with a slow, unnatural motion, it tilted its head to the side. A clicking sound filled the air, coming from its throat. I gripped my knife, heart hammering in my chest. Then it moved, not like a bird taking flight, not like an animal climbing down a tree. It dropped, straight down, and the second it hit the ground, it vanished into the darkness. I stayed awake the entire night, gripping my knife, the fire burning low beside me. The clicking never stopped. The first light, I broke camp and moved fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop for water. I just hiked. The further I got from that campsite, the more I told myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, my mind playing games after too much time alone. But then I saw the tracks. Not human, not bird, something in between. Long, clawed impressions in the dirt. Three-pronged, like talons. And they followed me. I moved faster. The trees were denser here, the path harder to follow, but I kept pushing forward. My plan was to cut my trip short and make it back to my truck by nightfall. But I wasn't alone. Every few minutes, I'd hear it. The clicking, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always following. I forced myself not to run. Running in the woods was a good way to get hurt, to get lost. But my body screamed at me to move faster. I hiked for hours, legs burning, lungs tight. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, a shadow moved. Ahead of me, it had circled around, cut me off. I skidded to a stop, heart slamming against my ribs. The creature perched on a low-hanging branch, its body half hidden by the leaves. It was closer now. I could see its skin, gray, leathery, stretched tight over its thin frame. Its eyes were empty, its mouth too wide. And then, it did something that made my blood run cold. It mimicked me, tilted its head, raised an arm, a wing, like it was mocking my movements. Then it dropped from the tree again, disappearing into the brush. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't care about the risk of falling. I just ran. The forest blurred around me, branches clawing at my face, my pack slamming against my back. The clicking was everywhere now. Close, behind me, ahead of me, above me. I burst into a clearing, my truck finally in sight, parked just where I left it. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it. I just threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt, my hands shaking on the wheel. Only when I hit the highway did I finally glance in the rearview mirror. The forest stood still, empty, but the silence stayed with me, like something was still listening. I never went back to that area. I still hike, still camp, but I don't go alone anymore. And every so often, In the dead of night, I wake up in my bed, heart pounding, because sometimes even miles from the woods, I swear I hear the clicking. I had been planning this hike for months. Ever since I saw a post about the remote backcountry trails in Montana, I knew I had to go. The pictures showed vast, untouched wilderness, dense forests, jagged peaks, and long, winding rivers cutting through the valleys. It looked perfect, the kind of place you could go for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no noise, no people. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I picked a route that wasn't well-traveled. It was about 30 miles out and back, cutting through thick pine forests, over high ridges and past deep, isolated lakes. The elevation gain was brutal, but I was ready for it. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, enough food for 5 days. Everything was set. I drove out early, the sun barely up, the roads empty. By the time I reached the trailhead, there was only one other car in the lot, an old truck with faded paint and mud caked on the tires. I didn't think much of it. Probably another hiker already out on the trail. I checked my pack one last time, tightened the straps, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a slow climb through dense forest. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. The trail was narrow, winding between massive trees, the ground soft with fallen needles. Birds called from the branches, and now and then, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. A squirrel, maybe a deer. After about an hour, I reached the first real climb. The trail turned steep, the dirt loose beneath my boots. I leaned forward, using my trekking poles to push myself up. My breathing grew heavy, sweat starting to build under my pack. I stopped once to take a sip of water, looking back down at the forest below. The trees stretched out endlessly, dark green and unbroken. No roads, no buildings, just wilderness. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge. It was the perfect place to rest. Flat ground, a clear view of the valley below. I dropped my pack and sat down, stretching out my legs. I took a deep breath, enjoying the silence. That's when I noticed something. At the far end of the clearing, near the treeline, was an old fire ring. Just a circle of blackened stones, half covered in dirt and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But next to it, half buried in the grass, was something else. A boot. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, the laces missing. I walked over and picked it up. Inside, the insole was worn down to nothing, the toe caked with dried mud. Someone had left it here a long time ago. I looked around, but there was nothing else. No pack, no other gear, just the boot. I tossed it back down and headed out. The trail dropped steeply after that, winding down into a deep valley. The trees grew thicker, the air damp and cool. I passed a stream, the water clear and fast-moving, then started the next climb. It was slow going, my legs already tired, but I pushed through. I wanted to reach the lake before dark. It was just after 6 when I finally saw the water through the trees. The lake was small, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick forest. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky. I found a flat patch of ground near the shore and set up my tent. After eating, I sat by the water, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The air was still, the forest silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional ripple on the water's surface. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just a few depressions in the dirt near the water's edge. But they were fresh, too fresh. I stood up, my skin prickling. The prints were barefoot. Whoever left them hadn't been wearing shoes. And they weren't mine. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was just a wall of darkness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had come down for a drink. Maybe I was just seeing things. I went back to my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Just outside my tent. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound was close. Too close. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. When morning finally came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The forest was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But my bear spray was gone. I packed up fast. My whole body was on edge. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. I needed to get out. I moved quickly, barely stopping for water. The whole way back, I felt it. That prickling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. But the old truck was gone. And nailed to a tree near the lot was something I hadn't seen before. A boot, the same one I had found on the ridge. I have always loved hiking alone. There's something about being deep in the woods, away from everything, that makes the world feel real again. No traffic, no phone calls, just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind in the trees, and the quiet. That's why I chose this trail. It was remote, unmarked on most maps, and only known by a handful of people. A friend had mentioned it to me once, saying it was perfect for solitude. No crowds. No tourists, just miles of untouched forest. He also warned me not to go alone. Said the place had a weird reputation. People getting lost, strange sounds at night, things that didn't feel right. But I've been hiking solo for years. I've dealt with bears, bad weather, and getting turned around in the woods. A little isolation didn't scare me. I should have listened, because something was out there, and it was watching me. The hike started easy. A cool morning, clear skies, the trees thick and green. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding through the hills. I had packed light, just enough food for 3 days, my tent, a knife, a flashlight. By midday, I was miles from my car, deep in the wilderness. I hadn't seen a single person, just the way I liked it. Then, around late afternoon, I noticed something strange, the silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as I kept walking, I realized what was wrong. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, just nothing. I stopped, listening. The woods weren't supposed to be this quiet. Even in the dead of night, there's always some noise. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind moving through the trees. But now it was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Something about it made my skin crawl. I shook it off and kept moving. By sunset, I had found a clearing near a small creek, perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The silence never lifted. As darkness settled in, the air felt heavy, like the forest was pressing in around me. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches hanging motionless in the still air. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that I'd wake up in the morning, laugh about how I got spooked over nothing, and keep moving. Then I heard it, somewhere out there in the blackness of the trees. A single footstep, not an animal, not the wind, a single deliberate step. I froze, staring into the dark. My fire barely lit the edges of the clearing. Beyond that, it was pitch black. I waited, listened, nothing. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt on a hike in a long time. Fear. I forced myself to lie down, my knife close to my chest, and told myself I was just being paranoid. That's what I told myself. But I didn't sleep. Morning came slow. The second the sun was up, I was out of my tent, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. Just untouched forest. I felt stupid for being so on edge. Probably just my nerves. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. I shook it off and packed up. Today's hike was harder. Steeper terrain, thicker trees, a constant sense that I was not alone. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the trees. But every time I looked, it was just woods. Then, around midday, I found something I couldn't explain. A boot print, in the dirt right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't mine. It was bigger, wider, and it was fresh. The edges were crisp, undisturbed by wind or time. Someone else had been right here not long before me. I stopped, listening. Nothing. I should have turned around, but I didn't. I found it by accident. An old cabin, half hidden by trees, barely standing. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof sagging in the middle. Something about it felt wrong. I don't know why, but the moment I saw it, my stomach turned. Like I wasn't supposed to be here. The door was missing. Inside, there was nothing but an old table and a broken chair. And on the far wall, scratched deep into the wood, "Leave now." The letters were uneven, carved with something sharp. I felt my breath catch. Then, outside, a twig snapped. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. The trees stood still. The silence pressed in around me. I stepped out of the cabin, scanning the forest. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. Something was out there, watching. I turned and walked away fast. I didn't stop until I was miles down the trail. I set up camp earlier than usual. I wanted a fire going before dark. The unease hadn't left me. If anything, it was worse. The air felt thick, heavy, and that silence still hadn't broken. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, staring at the trees. Then, a sound. A low, steady breathing. Not mine, not an animal. Somewhere close. I turned my head slowly and saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the firelight. Tall, still. I couldn't see its face. Couldn't see anything but a dark shape in the trees. But I felt its eyes on me. The fire crackled. It didn't move. Neither did I. We just stood there. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep, didn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, waiting. The second the sky started to lighten, I packed my things. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just walked, fast. I didn't stop, didn't look around. I just moved. All day I felt it. That thing, whatever it was following me. I didn't see it, didn't hear it, but I felt it. By late afternoon, I saw something ahead, the road, my truck. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my gear in the back, and got in. I locked the doors. Then, for the first time all day, I looked back at the trees. Nothing, just still, quiet forest. But I knew something was still there, watching, waiting. I never went back. Camping had always been something I enjoyed, but I had never done it alone before. It was one of those things I had always told myself I'd get around to, but I never made it happen. Maybe I was just making excuses, or maybe I was avoiding the silence that came with being alone in the woods. Either way, when the opportunity finally came, I decided to take it. I picked a remote spot deep in a national forest, miles from the nearest road. No campsites, no trails, just a place I had marked on a map from a hike years ago. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees. It seemed perfect. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, plenty of water, a good knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought my old bolt-action rifle, more out of habit than necessity. I wasn't worried about animals, but having it made me feel a little safer. The drive out took most of the morning. The last stretch was on a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached the point where I'd have to hike in, the sun was already high. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trees were thick, but the air was cool, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. It felt good to be away from everything, disconnected. No service, no people, just me and the woods. As I got closer to the clearing, the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The air felt heavier. I had been here before, but something about it felt different this time. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. It was just as I remembered. A flat patch of earth surrounded by towering trees, the river just beyond. I set up my tent near the tree line, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was peaceful. Then, just as the last bit of sunlight faded, I heard something. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice. A rustling in the trees behind me. I turned, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but something about it felt off. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed up longer than I planned, keeping the fire burning, but the woods stayed silent. Finally, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself inside, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. The tent was pitch black, the only sound my own breathing. Then I heard it again. The same rustling, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath. Then silence. I gripped the knife I had tucked in my sleeping bag, every muscle locked in place. I listened, heart pounding. The sound didn't come back. I forced myself to stay awake for a while, but eventually, exhaustion won. By morning, the fear from the night before felt distant, almost like a dream. The clearing looked the same, the river still flowed, the air was still. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my tent, stopping just outside before vanishing into the woods. A cold wave washed over me. Someone had been here, watching. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had planned to stay another night. Maybe it had just been another hiker passing through. Maybe they didn't even know I was here. But why walk so close? Why stop at my tent? The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the wind moved the branches, every time I heard the rustle of leaves, my heart jumped. I spent most of the afternoon gathering wood, trying to stay busy, but the unease never left. That night, I made sure the fire was big. I sat close to it, staring into the darkness, listening. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. A shape, barely visible between the trees. I froze, gripping my knife. It didn't move. I stared at it for what felt like hours. Then slowly it shifted, a step back, then another, then it was gone. I didn't sleep. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding, knife in hand, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling, stopping, a slow exhale just outside the tent. I stopped breathing, then silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. When the first light of dawn touched the tent, I forced myself to move. I unzipped the flap, stepping out. The fire was nothing but embers. The air was cold, and the footprints were back. This time, there were more of them, circling the campsite, stopping by my tent, then leading back into the woods. I packed fast, shoving everything into my bag, hands shaking. Every second I spent there felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The hike back felt longer. The woods felt darker. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt through my body. Halfway to my truck, the smell hit me, rotten, like meat left out too long. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I just kept walking. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I started the engine. Then I looked up, and I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, still watching. I didn't stick around. I tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on paved roads, the forest shrinking in my mirrors. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being deep in the woods with nothing but the sound of my footsteps and the wind in the trees that made me feel in control. No distractions, no waiting for anyone, just me and the trail. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, including a few in remote areas, so I wasn't worried when I planned a trip to explore a lesser-known section of the national forest. I had found an old map online, scanned from a book written decades ago. It showed trails that no longer appeared on modern maps, old logging roads, abandoned paths, routes that had been forgotten over time. I wasn't expecting anything too difficult, just a long, quiet hike through an area few people visited anymore. I packed light but smart water, food, a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, and my GPS watch. My phone wouldn't have service out there, but I brought a paper map and compass as backup. The trailhead was empty when I arrived early in the morning. The first few miles were easy, following a well-marked path through thick trees. The forest was dense but beautiful, sunlight filtering through the leaves, the ground covered in ferns. I moved quickly, enjoying the cool air and the solitude. After about an hour, I reached the spot where the old trail split off. There was no sign, no marker, just a faint gap in the undergrowth where the path had once been. It was overgrown, barely visible, but I could still make it out. I stepped off the main trail and onto the forgotten one. The difference was immediate. The forest felt quieter, the trees closer together. The air was heavy, damp from the morning mist. The trail was narrow, uneven, roots and rocks jutting out everywhere. I had to slow down, stepping carefully, using my hands to push through thick brush. About an hour in, I found the first sign that something wasn't right. A boot print. It was deep in the mud, not fresh but not old either. Someone else had been here recently. I crouched, studying it. The tread pattern was clear, meaning whoever left it had been carrying weight. A backpack, most likely. But the position was strange. The toe was dug in like they had been moving fast. I stood up and kept walking, telling myself it was nothing, probably just another hiker who had come through days ago. Then I saw the second thing, a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It was dark, possibly from a jacket or backpack, the edges frayed. I reached out and touched it, damp, not from rain. I swallowed hard, shaking it off. The trail was old. Maybe hunters used it now, or someone had tried hiking it before turning back. I kept moving, following the faint path deeper into the woods. The forest got thicker, the light dimmer. The trees were massive, their trunks covered in moss. I checked my GPS, still tracking. I wasn't lost. Then I smelled it. Rotten. Not strong, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I slowed down, scanning the ground ahead. The smell grew stronger, filling my nose, making my breath come short. Then I saw it. A deer, or what was left of one. Its body was twisted, half hidden in the underbrush, torn open. The ribcage was exposed, picked clean. The legs were bent at unnatural angles, the head tilted back as if it had been dropped there. I felt my skin crawl. Predators did this, but something about it was off. The body hadn't been dragged, no signs of a struggle, no scattered fur or disturbed ground, just the carcass left there, I backed away, my pulse hammering. Then I heard it, a sound from the trees. Not an animal, not the wind, something moving. I turned slowly, scanning the forest, my heart thudding in my chest. The trees were thick, the shadows deep. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something. Presence. I moved, carefully at first, then faster. My breathing was too loud, my steps too heavy. The trail was harder to follow now, barely visible. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see something move in the trees. Then I found the footprints, deep, erratic, the kind made when someone isn't walking normally, when they're running. My mouth went dry. They led down a steep slope, disappearing into thicker woods. I didn't follow them. I turned back, heading the way I came. My pace quickened. The forest felt different now, darker, the air heavier. Every sound made my skin prickle. The rustling leaves, the distant creak of branches. I wasn't alone. Then another sound, closer, a crunch of leaves. I didn't stop. I walked faster, my legs burning as I climbed the slope. Every step felt slower than it should have. The ground seemed to pull at me, the air pressing in. Then finally, I saw the main trail. I ran. When I hit the open path, I didn't stop. I kept going until I saw my car. I didn't look back. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. It was only when I was miles away, back in town, that I checked my GPS. The route was there, but something was wrong. The trail wasn't on the map. It didn't exist. I don't know where I went. I don't know what was out there, but I'm never going back.